Okay, it is 3 o'clock. So welcome everybody to the final FAFP event of 2021. Today we have an excellent speaker, and hopefully you'll stay afterwards as we recognize some of the outstanding achievements of our members, and hopefully you'll participate in the networking breakout sessions that we have afterwards. We certainly want to thank all of our members for your continued support, and certainly the sponsors, and many of those are highlighted on the slide. And so just to start off with a couple housekeeping items, please keep your video and audio off throughout the duration of the program. We'll ask Alex to answer some questions from the audience at the end of his presentation, and we have a team of volunteers who will be monitoring the chat box and facilitating your questions with Alex. So please do enter any questions you have directly in the chat box. We'll also be recording the program to post on FAFP.net, which has recently been revamped. So again, please check that out. Today, our speaker is Special Agent Alex Silverstein. Alex has been a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1996. Prior to that, he worked as both an investigator and prosecutor in the Prince George County, Maryland State Attorney's Office for almost 7 years. During his career as an FBI special agent, Special Agent Silverstein was assigned to the Washington Field Office, where he investigated drug matters, property crimes, violent crimes, and national security matters. He was a first responder to the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, and participated in many of the major investigations that took place from 1997 to 2003 at the Washington Field Office. In 2003, Silverstein was promoted to supervisor at the FBI headquarters and was assigned to the Strategic Information and Operations Center until 2007. Following that assignment, he was transferred to the Jacksonville Division, where he supervised a national security squad. In 2009, he returned to his investigative duties and investigated bank robberies and other violent crimes. Especially Silverstein worked on the Sommer Thompson kidnapping murder investigation and the investigation into the Guardians gang, who were responsible for multiple armed bank and home invasion robberies. In 2014, S.A. Silverstein was named Weapons of Mass Destruction Coordinator for the Jacksonville Division and has been serving in that role ever since. S.A. Silverstein serves on the evidence response team, is cross-trained as a paramedic, so he supports the SWAT team as well. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Baltimore. And with that, Alex, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here with you all today. I appreciate any opportunity I have to talk about the FBI. I've been doing this for a very, very long time. And the job of being a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation is probably the best job in the world. So I welcome any opportunity to talk about this. I am the Weapons of Mass Destruction Coordinator for the Jacksonville Division. In the Jacksonville Division, we cover the North 40 counties of Florida. We go all the way out to Pensacola from Jacksonville and down to Ocala. And many of you may be wondering, what do weapons of mass destruction have to do with the food industry? There are no weapons of mass destruction in the food industry. If you'd had my mother's cooking, you might disagree, but in truth, the weapons of mass destruction program for the FBI is a little more broad than talking about bombs or things that can make you sick. We're talking about clearly property damage and personal injury. We're also very concerned about weapons that can cause great economic injury to the United States. But moreover, we're very concerned with the fear that weapons of mass destruction cause. A weapon of mass destruction can do very little damage in terms of property damage or personal injury, but the fear of that can cause ripples that we still feel even today. In 2001, there were 5 letters with Bacillus anthracis that were mailed to various media outlets and elected officials throughout the United States. And in the 20 years since that happened, no one opens their mail the same way. We are still gripped with that fear. In 2001, 4 airliners were hijacked. And even though it's 20 years later, none of us get on a plane the same way. We're constantly looking at other people. It's that fear that we're all still feeling from these attacks. So for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our primary goal with weapons of mass destruction is prevention. We have to prevent, clearly we have to prevent the use of a weapon of mass destruction, but even before that, we have to prevent the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, because once it's used, it's too late. Where does the food industry come into all of this? We view the food industry as critical infrastructure throughout the United States. And anytime that critical infrastructure gets disrupted, that's a major disruption for all of us. In 2 or 3 years ago, this was kind of an abstract concept, but with the pandemic and supply chain problems, we are all seeing this, that how a small wrinkle can affect a lot of us. Now, all of what we've been seeing over the last year or two has all been the result of a pandemic. Now, just imagine if somebody intended to harm our supply chains. Imagine if somebody had intended to disrupt our food supply. That would, the fear, the anxiety that we've seen now, we multiplied tenfold. So what we do in the FBI is we seek out the members of the critical infrastructure, like the food industry, to provide education on what our weapons of mass destruction program is, to give you that knowledge of what to be on the lookout for, and to encourage you and empower you to actually call the FBI anytime that you have any suspicion, and bring us in to any type of investigation or inquiry, so that we can either determine that it's an intentional act, or that we can move quickly to determine that it's not an intentional act. So that way we can restore equilibrium, we can restore everybody to their normal course of business. So some of the things that we look at in the FBI are what you imagine for weapons of mass destruction: threats from chemical, threats from biological agents, radiological, nuclear, and from explosives, CBRNE. When we talk about chemical threats, we talk about toxic industrial chemicals that have a legitimate purpose but can be perverted into weapons. One of the things that we are very interested in, for instance, is chlorine. Liquid chlorine is actually used for a multitude of processes that are beneficial. Jacksonville is the leading exporter of liquid chlorine to the Caribbean. So we see a lot of it here in Jacksonville. We don't ever want to stop that, because it's used by Caribbean nations to purify their water. But yet, if a bad guy got a hold of it, it can be used as a weapon. We are also following very closely things that come out of Europe in terms of chemical agents. Years past, we would talk about chemical agents as just being used by a nation state in terms of warfare. But what we've seen in Kuala Lumpur and in England over the last 3 or 4 years is that there are nation states that are not afraid of using chemical agents out in public. I'm referring to the attack in Salisbury, England, against 2 Russian dissidents, or Russian dissident and his daughter. And that resulted in an entire town essentially being contaminated. That actually highlights a lot of the fear that we're talking about when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, because that chemical agent was aimed only at one person, and at least 3 others were contaminated, and an entire town had to be decontaminated. As a result of this, there was a great deal of anxiety of people going back into that town to go shopping, to go to restaurants, and the town had to go to great measures to try to attract people back. Biological threats, right? I've talked about the anthrax attacks in 2001. Some of the other attacks that the FBI has investigated was the 1984 Rajneeshi cult out in Western Oregon, where members of a cult, in an effort to influence a local election, contaminated salsa bars and salad bars throughout Wasco County, in an effort to make townspeople sick so that they wouldn't participate in a local election. This caused a lot of sickness. Hundreds of people were sick, and several dozen were hospitalized. But what it really highlighted back in the 1980s was the vulnerability of ready-to-eat food from a weapon of mass destruction. Biological agents have been considered throughout time as things that can be used against people. We're constantly concerned about that. Sometimes they're romanticized. If you are a Breaking Bad fan, then if you're familiar with the use of ricin, which is a biological toxin, which is derived from the castor beans, which grow naturally here in Florida. If you've got woods behind your house, you can go probably take a walk for about a mile, and you'll probably find a castor bean plant. Castor beans are legal to own. The castor oil has got many legitimate purposes, but if you derive the toxin from that castor bean, it can be used as a very deadly poison. We're also concerned about radiation, not so much the nuclear weapons, although while we are concerned about them, the likelihood of them being used here is very, very low, thank goodness. But radioactive sources are used throughout commerce, in the medical industry, for sterilization. And if some threat actor got a hands on a radioactive source, it can be used to contaminate the public. So we do a lot of outreach with that, with the industries that use radiation, such as the medical industry. Construction firms use radioactive sources, and things of that nature. We are concerned about radioactivity also when it comes to the food supply, because some radioactive sources can be used to contaminate food. Once again, we get back into that ready-to-eat foods. These are the things that we're concerned about. And finally, explosives. Explosives, we're not so much concerned about explosives when it comes to the food sector, with the exception of someone using explosives to disrupt the supply chain somewhere. How can things be, how can this threat be applied? Some of it can come from an outside attack, some threat actor from outside, whether it's an extremist organization or someone who's been inspired by an extremist organization, can get their hands on a weapon of mass destruction, whether it's some toxic industrial chemical or a radioactive source, and contaminate a food supply somewhere. It can also be an insider at at a food industry plant or a restaurant or a supermarket who contaminates a food supply to get even with a company that they have a grievance against, whether they themselves are an extremist for some sort of ideology. They can contaminate a food supply there. What we do is we come on out to your industries, and I offer it up to membership that I or several of the assistants in the Jacksonville division or WMD coordinators throughout the state of Florida are willing to come on out to your facilities and provide training on what these threats look like. We help instruct employees on what suspicious activity looks like, what to be concerned about, what not to be concerned about. Very rarely do we see a brute force attack where someone actually does a physical assault on a plant to contaminate a food supply. More often we see an insider threat. When I did a presentation with another group, and one of the things that they brought up was the attack that occurred down in South Florida of an employee who had been let go, a longtime employee had been let go, and he produced a firearm and began shooting employees there. That type of insider threat is probably more likely to happen than a brute force attack against a food plant. We are working on a product with our FBI headquarters in terms of a poster that we can distribute to all of you that provides some warning signs for physical attacks or insider attacks, things to be on the lookout for, strange surveillance, really anything that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up is something that should be reported to local law enforcement and to the FBI. And we provide a toll-free number for people to actually make that connection with the FBI. It's a 1-800-CALL-FBI, and the calls can be completely anonymous. We also work with the food industry to help empower employees that they can report suspicious activity and not be afraid of any type of retribution from the company. This is something that we do in conjunction with your industry. That we're not going behind your back to try to convince employees to be informants. For us, what we want to do is we want to work in conjunction with you to keep your industry safe. It is we encourage employees not only to protect themselves, but to also protect their jobs, protect your industry, protect your job, protect your company, so that we can all get a paycheck, so that we can all earn a living. If somebody does something really bad, we are all going to suffer. A supply chain interruption affects all of us, not just one single plant or one single company. So that is a lot of what we do. Our presentations are mobile. They are also, they can be crafted to fit our audience. If we are talking to executives, we'll have one type of message. If we're talking to line workers, we'll have a similar message, but tailored to them. Some of the threats that we are looking at have been associated with insider threats in some labs of people who we are constantly vigilant for people who have access to biological pathogens. We work with industry and with research firms to make sure that these people who have access to these pathogens, that they are reliable, that they won't turn and use these pathogens for anything other than research. I mentioned ricin. That continues to be a threat. So long as the acquisition of castor beans and things that toxins can be derived from is legal, this is going to continue to be a threat. And finally, one of the other threats that we're seeing are on the rise are hoax threats. And you may think, well, why is that really a threat? But the honest truth is that hoax threats almost have the same disruptive power as an actual act of a weapon of mass destruction, because we have to treat every threat as viable until it's proven otherwise. Otherwise, we run in danger of being complacent, and people can then get hurt. Thinking back to the anthrax attacks back in the 1990s and the year 2000, law enforcement was beset with these threatening letters with white powders in them, so much so that we weren't even responding to them at a certain point. People weren't calling them in, and the threat actor who perpetrated the Amerithrax attacks took advantage of that we were not taking them seriously at the time, and he was able to get a lot of people sick as a result of that. So hoax threats become a real danger because they're very disruptive. If your company receives one of these threats, we have to take it seriously. We all do, and not just law enforcement, but the public as well. We have to take it seriously. We have to examine it. We have to make sure that if somebody's threatening that they're sending ricin, we have to make sure that it's not ricin. Or if they say it's Bacillus anthracis, we have to make sure that it's not Bacillus anthracis. So that becomes very disruptive. Your business has to shut down for a period of time until we can determine that it's not a threat. These hoax threats, they're very easy to perpetrate. All you need is an envelope and a white powder, and you can perpetrate these threats. We examine every threat individually, and we take them all seriously until we prove that it's not a threat. So these are some of the things that we're looking into. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, Jason or Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is Jamie. So if everybody would please post any questions in the chat, we'll read them out loud. And I have one to kick us off, if that's all right. I was actually wondering, because food defense isn't detailed in the food code, do you see that becoming a more specific question in the future?
I certainly hope so. In my discussions with the folks at the University of Florida, we were talking a lot about the Food Safety Modernization Act, and really what that considers is less of an intentional act and more of maybe a poor food handling. I don't want to call it an unintentional act, but it is it doesn't really consider what some of the law enforcement interests are anytime that we see food contamination. I'll give you a for instance with that. In other states, fortunately not here in Florida, we have seen in food bars where people have entered into supermarkets, restaurants, and they have contaminated a food supply, a ready-to-eat food supply with something. And I'm being very general on purpose because following some of the Food Safety Modernization Act protocols, what the staff does is they quickly remove that food so that consumers can't have it, which is good because that keeps people from getting sick. The problem then becomes is that law enforcement's not notified, that food is not preserved for evidence, and now I have no way of determining because the food decays. It decays any type of agent. If you don't preserve it correctly, I might not be able to tell if there's any type of chemical agent. So what I can't do at that point is I can't attribute that action to a particular person, which means that person gets away with it and can then do it again. So getting back to your original question, I am hoping that the Food Safety Modernization Act is going to take into consideration the process that law enforcement has to go through to attribute an act to a person, because stopping the next attack is really a priority for the FBI. And I saw that there was a question in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. The next one was from Rachel. What are some examples of things or behaviors we should be looking out for?
So that's actually a great question. For an external attack, one of the things that we encourage people to be on the lookout for is strange surveillance. Cars and people and trucks that are unusual. What's unusual? Well, your businesses, your neighborhoods better than anybody. And it is really kind of what doesn't belong. When you walk out of your house in the morning, if there is a strange car or a new car in your neighbor's driveway, you're going to notice. If there are vehicles, if there are strange people walking by your food plant, you're going to know. So that is one of the behaviors that we are looking to be reported. Strange people showing up and being in an area that they're not supposed to be. That type of behaviors, we'd like that reported. Photography, unusual photography. Now, photography in and of itself is not a crime. And it could be somebody who's taking pictures. It could be an economic competitor, but I'm a weapons of mass destruction guy, which means I am absolutely a worst case guy. So that is, that's one of the things that we look for too. It's that strange surveillance or unusual surveillance. People, vehicles, photography or videoing, that's new. Objects showing up in the workplace that don't belong. Could it be a bomb? Could it be some kind of surveillance package? These are the things that we want reported to law enforcement. The other type of threat being an insider threat, some of the things to look for are your fellow employees that are out of their area. Fellow employees showing up to work when they're not supposed to work, staying late, coming in early when it is unexplained. Bruce Ivins, the researcher who the FBI believes was responsible for the Amerithrax attacks, was in the lab at all different hours when he wasn't supposed to be there. And by the same token, strange absences when people are gone when they should be there. Also, when we talk about the insider threat, people who are making comments that indicate that they are very disgruntled at work. I don't want to take away anyone's right to complain about being at work. We say all the time in the FBI that FBI agents only complain about two things: change and status quo. So it's everybody's right to complain, but we all know as adults, sometimes there's a difference between somebody complaining and somebody who's really disgruntled. That kind of behavior, when it crosses that line from I hate Mondays to I really hate this company and these people, they're going to get theirs. That kind of behavior is indicative of someone who may be headed towards some sort of insider attack. Evidence of mental instability. While I don't want to stigmatize people with mental health problems, sometimes the people who are having mental health issues that are very severe, that can cause violent outbreaks, that type of behavior needs to be taken into consideration to keep everybody safe. Mental health is something that we take very seriously in the FBI, and people should get help when they have mental health issues, but we also have a duty to protect our fellow citizens. So we do need to be aware of who's around us and what kind of positions are they in. Somebody who is hearing voices and they are working in an area where they can do some damage to other people or to their company, these are people that we need to keep an eye on. We need to maybe move them to an area where they're not a threat to themselves or to others. Someone who has a sudden financial difficulty can be vulnerable to committing an insider attack. And when I say that, it's economic forces can be kind of cutthroat. Could it be that a rival company seeks out a disgruntled employee, an employee who's having money problems, and perhaps through a cutout pays them to do some damage to a food supply, and now that economic damage is done? So those are some of the behaviors that we're looking for. That's a fantastic question. The next question I saw was, if somebody intentionally contaminates food, is it considered terrorism or vandalism, and what determines the category of the incident? Well, I will tell you that if somebody contaminates a food supply, it's not vandalism. That's actually food adulteration is a federal felony, or any type of drug adulteration is actually a federal felony. It goes way beyond vandalism. Whether it is what determines whether it's terrorism or not is what the motivation is. The strict definition of terrorism is somebody who is trying to affect some sort of ideological change through the use of violence. And that can be a political change, it can be a religious change, any type of ideological change through violence. That's the legal definition of terrorism. So if somebody adulterates food because they want to bring down American society in favor of pick your ideology, that's terrorism. Somebody who replaces viable drugs with saline solution, that's a felony, that's a criminal act. And who makes that determination? It is law enforcement that determines what the threat is. Through our investigation, through available intelligence, we will determine what is the actual ideology, what caused this. Because finding out the why becomes important to stopping the next attack.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions in the chat. Did anybody have any others? All right, I'll hand it back to Jason. Alex, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very low tech. I'm going to put, well, that's actually backwards. So let me, I'm going to provide Jason. Actually, Jason's got all my contact information. So Jason, if you'd be so kind as to share my contact information with the attendees.
Sure can.
If any of you want an individualized presentation from the FBI about the weapons of mass destruction program, please let me know. As I said, that we are working with our headquarters to print posters that'll be suitable for hanging in a break room or a locker room or on an employee bulletin board. And so when I have those, Jason, if you don't mind, I'll use you as my point of contact. When I have them, I'll send Jason a sample, and then we'll distribute it to the rest of the group. And if anybody's interested in having those, we will be happy to provide those.
Sure, we could probably put them on our website, and then that'll be an easy way to distribute it.
That's awesome. Thank
All right.
you all very much for having me.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thanks for that excellent presentation. Certainly a lot to think about